Welcome back to RotoQL University. This is our NFL strategy course, and we'll be wrapping up our positional breakdowns with tight ends, kickers, and defense selection. This is specifically for cash games. Sahil, I know you're excited to talk about these positions.
Yep, the make or break fantasy positions.
Yep, a lot of good stuff in here. Let's get started. So we'll get started with tight ends.
Alright, so tight ends are obviously similar to wide receivers in the sense that they pretty much catch balls is their primary scoring method. So again, we want to focus on similar things that we look at wide receivers, and that is targets. Yards per catch, yards per carry. We don't have to worry about yards per carry with tight ends, but certain tight ends are going to be check downs, like a Jason Witten versus a player like a Gronk or Travis Kelce, someone who can stretch a field a bit more. Play call distribution, again, we want to look at offenses that throw the ball. Defensive versus position. Can be interesting for tight ends since I think there's a lot more variance in the way teams target tight ends defensively. Because once you get past the top 3 or 4 tight ends, there's really not too much talent. So we really want to focus on defensive versus position, which can kind of give us an idea of which of the lower priced tight ends may break out in a certain week. Salary is obviously a very important one. Salaries are going to be a lot lower for tight ends on average, and that's no surprise. And again, value is going to be one of the key metrics that we're going to look at. So I'm going to just run through this quickly since we've gone through this a lot. Game flow, so we want to target teams that are going to throwing the ball. Teams that are going to be putting up a lot of fantasy points. Snap count is also very important for tight ends. Certain tight ends are going to be blocking only, so maybe something that we want to kind of dive into is maybe the number of routes that they run. And that will be a good indicator of how they're going to perform, I think even better than snap count. Red zone targets is also very important since tight ends are going to have disproportionately more red zone targets. So looking at those tight ends that get red zone targets are going to allow you to kind of figure out which tight ends may hit value in a certain week. Tight ends have a lot more coefficient of variation, even more so than wide receivers. And that's because they're more dependent on touchdowns. Because outside, again, of the top 3 or 4, you're very rarely going to get a tight end that's going to get 5 catches, 60-plus yards. So a large portion of their fantasy performance is going to come from whether they can catch that red zone tight end touchdown. So for tight ends priced less than 4K, something that's interesting is this is obviously for DraftKings since FanDuel doesn't have tight ends priced less than 4K, but you'll see that they're generally appropriately priced. And then when you see that they've doubled their performance, that's generally when they catch a touchdown. So really what we can see here is that there's not too much to gain from targeting tight ends less than 4K, but in certain situations, again, we want to look at them and definitely not exclude them, even though they may have a hit or miss performance. So again, when we look at the plus minus by position for double-digit spreads, you'll see that tight ends are obviously going to be negative since they're more reliant on pass catching, just like we've seen with wide receivers, we're both negatives. And this is a situation where we'll see the favorite is actually slightly more negative than the dog. I think that's pretty much noise. I think the takeaway here is we don't really want to focus on tight ends with huge spreads, favorites or dogs. Let's jump into kickers. So kickers are only available on FanDuel. One thing we want to look at is weather. That's a very big one, and that's where you can make the biggest mistakes. You don't want to be kicking in high wind, preferably not snow or rain. They will reduce the amount of attempts a kicker takes and the weather. Projected points is definitely a big one. You want to target kickers that are going to score a lot of points. They're going to get extra points, and they're going to be able to move the ball at will. So taking those kickers are going to be one of the chalkiest ways to go. Pace is also an interesting one, and this goes hand to hand with projected points. The more plays you run, the more opportunities teams have to kick field goals. Red zone inefficiency. Teams that obviously can't score in the red zone are going to kick more field goals. This one makes sense, but a lot of red zone inefficiency is noisy. So we really want to kind of make sure we have a reason behind a team being red zone inefficient. Are they bad at running the ball, or have they just gotten unlucky? Times where we can really truly think that they've been inefficient and it's likely to continue. Then we're going to want to look at field goal kickers for those teams. Salary, generally we always want to look for a cheap kicker. There's generally a lot of min-price kickers that are very viable options. So we really want to look to there unless we have good reason not to. And again, it's good salary, so we want to go for a minimum price kicker that's going to score the most fantasy points. And that's generally a good sound cash game strategy for kickers.
Sile, can you think of a good reason to take a kicker that may be higher priced within this position?
In cash games, there's not as much, but sometimes if a kicker has a very high projected points and playing in altitude, that's one thing that we want to really look at too, is altitude. Kickers that are playing in Denver will generally outperform. So if a kicker, even like the Broncos offense, who looks like they were pretty inefficient in the red zone last year in the altitude, and if you have the extra salary with the lineup you like, that might be a situation to target it.
Got it.
Kickers are generally pretty consistent. Most of the variance comes from the length of field goals. So kickers will generally get roughly the same amount of field goal attempts in each game, and the distance is one that's going to bring a lot of variance. So that's why we want to target altitude kickers, which is specifically Denver, because they'll have a lot more 50-plus yard field goal attempts, which can be pretty valuable. Let's move on to defense. So we want to look at weather. Weather, again, can be pretty valuable. Wet conditions especially can lead to a lot of ball insecurity, as well as windy conditions, which can lead to more inaccurate passes. The opposing matchup is very important. And then going off that is the opposing sack rate. Sack rates are one of the most consistent events on defense and are easier to predict than interception, fumbles, and touchdowns. So we really want to focus on the QB, the opposing QB, and opposing offensive line. If a QB has a tendency to hold on the ball, has a weak offensive line, they're going to get sacked a lot. And that's going to be easier to predict than interceptions or touchdowns. Turnovers and opponent turnovers are obviously very important to the end fantasy score, but we really want to take the data with a grain of salt, since those things are very, very noisy, especially in the beginning of the season. And value. Most of the time, we're going to see that you can get pretty good value for defenses. Certain defenses can be a little more steady, like a Seahawks defense or a Broncos defense may have a higher salary, can be pretty consistent, but you can generally get good value for defenses that are in a lower price range. Using projected points, it's going to be very important in selecting the defenses beyond looking at the sack rates. Spread, over, under, and game flow are all going to contribute to that too. Defenses have the highest variance, and that's because a defensive touchdown is going to be a huge boost to their value. If you think that an average defense scores around 10 to 12 points, a touchdown is going to double that. So we really want to take it with a grain of salt when a defense has really been outperforming at the beginning of the season, because that's reliant on touchdowns, and those things usually don't last and will regress to the mean. So once we look at some of the Vegas data, we can see that double-digit spreads are pretty valuable for favorites, and that's no surprise. Favorites of double-digit spreads, opponents have low projected points, which is going to allow you to maximize your points allowed statistic of the defensive scoring, as well as teams are going to throw the ball more, which is going to allow you to get more sacks, more interceptions, and hopefully more defensive touchdowns. And dogs, that situation you just want to avoid. You don't really want to target defenses that are expected to give up a lot of points, and that should be no surprise to anybody. Let's take a look at a cash game example from last year. We'll see on tight end, we picked Scott Chandler. This was a week where Gronk was injured. You can see that he was obviously a very good play with catching a touchdown, and his ownership reflects that. And for his bargain price, he made a very good play. So this is a situation where we targeted a QB or tight end with less than 4K salary, and it really paid off. On our defense, we're going to look at the Redskins. This was against the Cowboys, who do have a very strong offensive line, but this particular week, Romo was injured, so having a backup QB in there really lowered their expected points against, and they had a pretty low salary. So while it wasn't a monster performance, for the salary that the Redskins were this week, it was a perfectly acceptable 8 points. Let's look at some of the resources that we've had. We can look at our Zendesk to figure out how to use RotoQL more. The QL Wire has lots of great content. And check out the rest of our videos at RotoQL University.